Greece is a land defined by its ruins. For centuries, pilgrims, poets, and tourists have flocked to the limestone rock of the Acropolis to gaze upon the Parthenon. These ancient stones, worn smooth by 2.5 millennia of wind and war, tell a story of the birth of Western civilization. They speak of philosophy, of democracy, and of a power that once commanded the Aegean. They are noble ruins sanctified by time. But if you drive just a few miles north of the historic center, to the suburb of Marousi, you will encounter a different kind of ruin. You will find the Olympic Athletic Center of Athens. Here, the decay is not noble. It is rotting. It is rusted. It is a modern necropolis of steel and glass that has been standing for less than 20 years, yet looks as if it has survived a nuclear winter. Massive steel arches, designed by the world's most expensive architect, bleach white under the relentless sun. The world-class diving pools, once the stage for human perfection, are filled with brown, stagnant sludge, home to frogs and mosquitoes rather than gold medalists. The softball stadium, built to seat thousands of cheering fans, is overgrown with thorns, its fences torn, its purpose entirely forgotten. This is not just a collection of abandoned buildings. It is a crime scene. In the summer of 2004, these structures were the center of the universe. Athens hosted the games of the XXVII Olympiad. It was supposed to be the homecoming. The games were returning to their birthplace. It was a spectacle of global unity, a dazzling display of fireworks, culture, and athletic prowess that cost billions of dollars. For 15 glorious days, Greece felt like the richest, most capable nation on earth. The world watched, and Greece shone. But when the Olympic flame was extinguished, the lights went out on the Greek economy forever. The Athens Olympics were initially projected to cost $4.5 billion. By the time the final receipt was tallied, if indeed a true tally even exists in the shredded archives of the Ministry of Finance, the cost had ballooned to over $15 billion. That is a budget overrun of nearly 400%. For a small nation of 11 million people, this wasn't just overspending, it was financial suicide. This expenditure didn't just drain the treasury, it shattered the structural integrity of the nation's finances. It masked a deep, festering rot of corruption, easy credit, and delusional optimism. When the global financial crisis hit, 4 years later, Greece didn't just stumble, it collapsed. The debt incurred to build these white elephants helped drag the Eurozone to the brink of disintegration and subjected the Greek people to a decade of brutal austerity, poverty, and national humiliation. Today, built on money, we are walking through the rusted gates of the modern Acropolis. We are peeling back the layers of nationalism and pride to reveal the financial cancer underneath. We are going to investigate how a 15-day party produced a 40-year hangover and how the dream of 2004 became the nightmare of a generation. To understand why a small Balkan nation would mortgage its future for a sporting event, we have to understand the psychological wound that birthed it. We have to go back to 1990. Athens was bidding to host the 1996 Centennial Olympics. It seemed like a lock. It was the 100th anniversary of the modern games. The narrative was perfect. The Golden Olympics returning to their ancient cradle. The Greeks were arrogant. They believed they were entitled to it by birthright. They didn't lobby hard. They didn't play the political game. They simply expected the International Olympic Committee to bow to history. But the IOC is a business, not a history department. In a shocking upset that stunned the sporting world, they awarded the 1996 Games to Atlanta, Georgia, the home of Coca-Cola. The rejection was devastating. It was a national humiliation. The Greek delegation left Tokyo in tears, feeling that commercialism had defeated heritage. They felt betrayed, but that humiliation planted a seed of desperate, toxic ambition. The ruling elite of Greece decided that they would not just win the games eventually, they would force the world to respect them. They would prove that Greece was no longer the poor cousin of Europe, a chaotic state of waiters and taxi drivers, but a modern European superpower. This ambition coincided with a massive shift in the geopolitical landscape, the birth of the euro. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Greece was preparing to join the eurozone. For decades, the Greek drachma had been a weak, volatile currency with high inflation and punishing interest rates of 18 or 20%. But as Greece cooked the books, with the help of investment banks like Goldman Sachs, to meet the entry requirements for the euro, something magical and dangerous happened. The financial markets began to treat Greek debt as if it were German debt. Interest rates plummeted. Suddenly, the Greek government could borrow money almost for free. The yield on Greek bonds dropped to match Germany's. It was an intoxicating drug. It was like giving a gambler a black card with no limit. The government of Prime Minister Kostas Simitis saw the Olympics not as a cost, but as an investment in the new Greece. The vision was grand. The Games would force the modernization of Athens. New highways, a new airport, a new metro system. It was the big idea, the megali idea, reborn for the 21st century. The face of this vision was Gianna Angelopoulos Daskalaki, a wealthy, charismatic powerhouse. She took over the bidding committee and charmed the IOC. In 1997, when Athens was finally awarded the 2004 Games, the streets of Athens erupted in celebration. It was seen as a validation. Greece was modern. Greece was capable. Greece was rich. But the money flowing into Athens wasn't earned revenue. It was debt. It was dirty money in the sense that it was borrowed against a future that could never pay it back. The budget was set at a modest 4.6 billion euros. It was a fiction from day one. The planners ignored the reality of Greek bureaucracy, the power of the construction unions, the archaeological delays, and the history of land disputes. They were high on the cheap credit of the eurozone, blinded by the prestige. They weren't building stadiums for athletes. They were building monuments to their own egos. They wanted to show the Germans, the French, and the Americans that Greece could throw a better party than anyone else. And like any party thrown on a credit card, the host didn't care about the price tag until the guests had left. Before we see how this dream turned into a logistical nightmare of panic and concrete. Make sure you're subscribed to Built on Money to uncover more hidden economic histories. Winning the bid is the easy part. Building the city is the hard part. And for the first 3 years after winning the Games, Greece did something truly remarkable. It did absolutely nothing. Between 1997 and 2000, the organizing committee was paralyzed by infighting, political squabbling, and bureaucratic inertia. Not a single shovel hit the ground. The planning committees held endless meetings in air-conditioned offices, moving papers from one side of the desk to the other, debating the aesthetics of logos while the clock ticked down. It was a classic case of administrative paralysis. By 2000, the International Olympic Committee was in a state of panic. Juan Antonio Samaranch, the president of the IOC, issued a yellow card to Athens, an unprecedented public warning. There were whispers in the halls of Lausanne that the Games might be moved to South Korea or back to Sydney. This threat triggered a national emergency. The government hit the panic button. And in the construction industry, panic has a very specific price. It is called the speed premium. When you have 7 years to build a stadium, you can bid out contracts, negotiate prices, and manage the supply chain. When you have 3 years, you pay whatever the contractor asks. You pay for triple shifts. You pay for air freighting materials that should have come by ship. You suspend competitive bidding laws in the name of national interest. The construction of the Athens Games became a feeding frenzy for the Greek oligarchs. A handful of powerful families controlled the construction sector, and they knew the government had no choice but to pay. They formed cartels. They divided the projects among themselves. The initial budgets were shredded. Take the Olympic Stadium, the OAK. The organizers decided they needed a centerpiece, something iconic to rival the Sydney Opera House or the Eiffel Tower. They didn't want a simple concrete bowl. They wanted art. They hired Santiago Calatrava, the Spanish architect famous for his complex skeletal designs. He designed a massive, intricate roof made of glass and white steel to cover the existing stadium. It was beautiful. It was also an engineering nightmare. The roof weighed 18,000 tons. It consisted of two massive steel arches that had to be assembled off-site and slid into place on giant rails. The complexity was staggering. The glass had to be specially manufactured in Germany. The steel had to be imported. The welding required specialized labor that Greece didn't have. The cost of the roof alone ballooned to over 250 million euros, more than the cost of building entire stadiums in other countries. And what was the functional purpose of this roof? To shade the spectators from the sun for 2 weeks. It added 0 seats. It added 0 revenue. It was pure aesthetic vanity. But the real budget killer was an event that happened thousands of miles away. September 11, 2001. The Athens Games were the first Summer Olympics to be held after the 9/11 terror attacks. The security paradigm shifted overnight. The initial security budget was a modest sum, calculated for a pre-9/11 world. By 2004, it had exploded to over $1.5 billion. Athens became a fortress. A surveillance blimp hovered over the city 24 hours a day, monitoring the citizens. Patriot missile batteries were installed around the venues. Tens of thousands of police and soldiers were deployed. NATO fleets patrolled the coast. A consortium led by the American company SAIC was hired to build the C4I security system, a command and control network that cost hundreds of millions. Crucially, this security system never actually worked properly during the games, leading to lawsuits and scandals for years afterward, but the money was spent regardless. The delays continued until the bitter end. In the months leading up to the opening ceremony, the world press descended on Athens, not to cover the athletes, but to cover the mud. Headlines in the New York Times and The Guardian asked, "Will Athens be ready?" The roof wasn't finished. The tram lines weren't connected. The swimming pools were empty. To finish on time, the government threw more money at the problem. They abandoned all oversight. Cost plus, contracts became the norm. If a contractor said they needed another $10 million to finish the landscaping by Friday, they got it on Thursday. Checks were signed without audits. The final price tag for the construction phase is still a matter of debate because the accounting was so chaotic. But conservative estimates suggest the infrastructure costs alone exceeded $10 billion. This for a country with a GDP roughly the size of the state of Connecticut. But the financial tragedy wasn't just in the amount of money spent. It was in what they built. And that brings us to the core analysis of the business model failure. Would you have invested in this? If you saw a government spending billions on a ping pong stadium with no post-game tenant, would you have bought their bonds? Let us know in the comments. The most dangerous lie in the economics of the Olympics is the concept of the legacy. Host cities always claim that the billions spent on stadiums will leave a lasting footprint of sports culture, tourism, and urban regeneration. In Athens, the legacy was a lie of omission. The core failure of the Athens business model was a fundamental misunderstanding of the distinction between permanent and temporary infrastructure. In rational host cities, niche sports like beach volleyball, ping pong, judo, and softball are played in temporary structures. You build scaffolding, you put in seats, and when the games are over, you take it down, sell the steel, and you have a nice public park left over. Athens, fueled by hubris and that intoxicating cheap Euro credit, decided to build permanent palaces for everything. They built a massive, state-of-the-art stadium for beach volleyball on the coveted Phalairo waterfront. They built a permanent arena for taekwondo. They built a specialized facility for weightlifting in Nicaea. These were concrete and steel behemoths, wired for electricity, plumbed for water, and designed to seat thousands. But here is the crack in the logic. Greece does not have a professional beach volleyball league. It does not have a hunger for watching taekwondo on a Tuesday night. It does not have a culture of baseball. There was no tenant. There was no business plan. There was no day 16 strategy. The Hellenic and Olympic complex is the prime example of this madness. Built on the site of the old airport, it was a massive sprawl of specialized venues for baseball, softball, fencing, and field hockey. The cost to build it was astronomical, running into hundreds of millions. But the cost to maintain it was the silent killer that no one budgeted for. Maintenance costs for specialized sporting venues are typically estimated at 2 to 4% of the construction cost annually. If you spend $200 million building a complex, you need $4 to $8 million a year just to keep the lights on, the security paid, the HVAC running, and the rust away. After the games ended, the revenue from these venues dropped to absolute zero. But the maintenance bills kept coming. The Greek state, now the owner of these white elephants, was hemorrhaging millions of euros a month just to guard empty buildings for vandals. It was a fiscal open wound. First, there is the crowding out effect. Regular tourists and business travelers who aren't interested in soccer stay away from the country during the tournament to avoid the chaos and high prices. The normal economy grinds to a halt. Second, there is leakage. If a fan stays at a Marriott in Doha and drinks a Pepsi, a significant chunk of that profit goes to U.S. corporations, not the Qatari local economy. The money touches the ground in Doha, but evaporates into the global financial system. But the biggest crack in the financial facade was the capacity paradox. Qatar faced a seemingly impossible logistical challenge. How do you house 1 million fans in a city with a population of less than 3 million? They built 100 new hotels specifically for this event. They docked massive cruise ships to act as floating hotels. They built fan villages out of shipping containers in the desert, charging $200 a night for a metal box with a beanbag chair. For 29 days, these were full. The prices were astronomical. The revenue per available room spiked. But a hotel is a 30-year asset. What happens on day 30? Doha now has an oversupply of hotel rooms that rivals Las Vegas or Orlando, but without the casinos or the Disney World to sustain it. Occupancy rates plummeted post-tournament. The revenue per available room, RevPAR, crashed. These hotels are now bleeding cash, requiring constant maintenance, staffing, and air conditioning while sitting half empty. The legacy of the World Cup is a hospitality sector on life support, likely requiring state bailouts or facing mass closures. Then there are the stadiums, the white elephants. Maintaining a world-class stadium costs millions of dollars a year. You need to water the grass in the desert, run the AC systems to prevent mold in the humidity, pay security, and clean the dust. In Europe, stadiums are used weekly by club teams with massive fan bases. The Allianz Arena in Munich is full every weekend. Qatar's domestic league, the Qatar Stars League, is small. The average attendance for a match is often a few hundred people, sometimes less than the number of players on the field. They do not need 8 massive 40,000-seat stadiums. It is like building a cathedral to host a book club. Qatar promised to recycle the stadiums. They pledged to dismantle the upper tiers of some arenas and donate the seats to developing nations in Africa. Stadium 974, the one made of shipping containers, was supposed to be completely disassembled and shipped elsewhere immediately after the round of 16. It was a beautiful sustainability narrative. But as of today, the reality is far messier. Dismantling a stadium is incredibly expensive. Shipping it is expensive. Finding a developing nation that actually wants a high-maintenance stadium and can afford to reassemble it is difficult. So, the stadiums sit there. They are monuments to excess, eating money just to exist. They're the most expensive lawn ornaments in history. The debt situation is unique here. Unlike Sri Lanka or Greece, Qatar paid cash for much of this. They didn't borrow from the IMF. They used their sovereign wealth fund. So, they're going to go bankrupt in the traditional sense. They won't default. The gas is still flowing and the prices are high. But opportunity cost is the real killer. That $220 billion came from finite resource. Natural gas will eventually run out, or the world will move on to renewables. That money was the heritage of future generations of Qataris. It could have been invested in a diversified sovereign wealth portfolio, like Norway's oil fund, generating compound interest for eternity. It could have bought Apple or Alphabet or transformed Qatar into a global hub for medical research. Instead, it was sunk into depreciating assets, concrete, steel, and a 4-week party. The return on investment, ROI, for the World Cup, in strictly financial terms, is horrific. It is arguably the worst ROI of any project in the history of finance. If you spent $220 billion to generate a projected $17 billion in economic activity, you have effectively destroyed over $200 billion of value. You have burned capital on a bonfire of vanity. Of course, the Qataris argue that the ROI isn't financial, it's geopolitical. It's about brand recognition. It's about insurance against invasion. It's about putting Qatar on the map so firmly that it can never be erased. But is a brand worth $250 billion? Is a logo on a TV screen worth the lives of thousands of workers? The collapse of the Qatar World Cup wasn't a sudden explosion. It is a slow, quiet fade into irrelevance. When the final whistle blew and Argentina lifted the trophy in that spectacular final, the world's attention instantly shifted. The caravans of journalists packed up their cameras. The influencers flew home to Dubai, London, or Los Angeles. The geopolitical spotlight that Qatar paid so dearly for turned off. What remains is the post-event hangover. Walk through the Lusail district today. It is a marvel of engineering, a city of the future rising from the sand. It has wide boulevards, gleaming towers, and a marina filled with yachts. But it feels sterile. It is a sim city built for a simulation that has ended. The wide boulevards are quiet. The metro trains run, mostly empty during the day. It is a city searching for a soul. It was built for a moment, not for a life. Then there is the reputational damage. Qatar wanted soft power. They wanted to be seen as modern, progressive, and welcoming. They wanted to be the bridge between East and West. Instead, the World Cup shined a high-intensity spotlight on the very things they wanted to hide: their labor laws and their treatment of the LGBTQ+ community. The One Love armband controversy, where FIFA banned European captains from wearing rainbow armbands, became a global PR disaster. Instead of talking about Qatari hospitality, the Western media spent weeks talking about censorship and intolerance. The sports washing backfired. For millions of Western viewers, the word Qatar is now permanently associated with bribery, migrant deaths, and backward social policies. They spent billions to improve their image, only to have their dirty laundry aired in 4K resolution to 4 billion people. There was also a corruption scandal after the event. Qatargate rocked the European Parliament, with allegations that Qatari officials paid bribes to European politicians to influence policy. It reinforced the narrative that Qatar thinks it can buy anything: votes, tournaments, laws, and people. It cemented the image of a nation that views the world as a vending machine. And what of the workers? When the construction stopped, the jobs stopped. The boom was over. Thousands of workers were sent home. Some returned with savings that transformed their families' lives. We must acknowledge that remittances from Qatar support millions of families in South Asia. But many returned with broken bodies, health issues from the heat that will shorten their lives, and debt from the recruitment fees they never fully paid off. The kafala system was technically reformed. Qatar abolished the exit permit requirement and the no objection certificate, theoretically allowing workers to change jobs. But human rights groups argue that implementation is patchy and the power dynamic remains overwhelmingly in favor of the employer. The men who built the pyramids of the 21st century have been largely forgotten, their sweat baked into the concrete of empty stadiums that will likely never be full again. The demographic shift has also reversed. The population of Qatar has begun to dip as the construction army leaves. The real estate market, built for a population of 3 million, is facing a rental crash. Landlords who borrowed money to build luxury apartments are facing defaults. The economic sugar high is over, and the crash is setting in. As the dust settles on Doha, we must look at the wider infection vector. Qatar 2022 didn't just break the financial records. It broke the moral and economic model of global sports. It proved that the mega event is no longer a celebration of sport, but a transaction of state power. For decades, hosting the World Cup or the Olympics was seen as a privilege for developed, democratic nations with existing infrastructure. France, Germany, the United States. But as the costs of these events spiraled into the billions, democracies started saying no. Taxpayers in Boston, Hamburg, and Oslo rejected bids for the Olympics. They looked at the balance sheets of Athens and Rio de Janeiro, cities left with debt and rotting stadiums, and they realized it was a scam. The gigantism of FIFA and the IOC made hosting a burden that no rational electorate would accept. This created a vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped the petrostates. Qatar was the proof of concept for a new era, the autocracy games. It proved that if you have a sovereign wealth fund and no voters to answer to, you can host anything. You can absorb the $200 billion loss because the money isn't real in the sense of tax revenue. It's resource rent. The legacy of Qatar 2022 is not found in the football academies of Doha. It is found in Riyadh. Watching Qatar's global moment, Saudi Arabia realized that sport is the fastest shortcut to relevance. The Saudi Public Investment Fund, PIF, went on a spending spree, buying Newcastle United, fracturing professional golf with LIV, and effectively securing the rights to the 2034 World Cup. Qatar taught the world's dictators a valuable lesson. The outrage is temporary, but the history books are permanent. The Western media will scream about human rights for a few months, but eventually the ball will roll. The fans will cheer, and the world will watch. Sport is the ultimate anesthetic. As we stand at the bottom of the Lusail iconic stadium and look up at its golden facade, what do we actually see? It is a structure of undeniable beauty. It is an engineering triumph, but it is also a tombstone. It is a monument to a specific moment in economic history, the peak of the fossil fuel era, where carbon revenue was so abundant it could be used to warp reality. The $220 billion price tag is a case study in the resource curse. Economists have long observed that nations with massive natural resource wealth often fail to develop functioning, diversified economies or democratic institutions. Instead, the money becomes a drug. It masks the structural cracks. It allows leaders to bypass the hard work of nation building and jump straight to the shopping spree. Qatar tried to buy a culture. They tried to buy a history. They tried to buy the vibes of a European football summer and transplant them into a conservative Islamic desert monarchy. And for 4 weeks, with the help of billions of dollars in air conditioning and marketing, they pulled off the illusion. But illusions are expensive to maintain. The lesson of Qatar 2022 is the limit of wealth. You can buy the most expensive players, the most famous architects, and the most corrupt officials. You can buy the attention of the world, but you cannot buy a soul for a city. You cannot buy the organic chaos of a fan culture that takes 100 years to grow. The empty streets of Lusail, the silent stadiums, and the ghost hotels are the receipts for this hubris. They're the leftovers of a banquet that was too big for the guests to eat. In the year 2050, when the gas reserves in the North Field begin to dwindle, and the world has pivoted to nuclear and solar, what will remain of this $220 billion gamble? The stadiums will likely be gone, dismantled, or crumbling in the salt air. The soft power will have evaporated, replaced by the next shiny object in the next wealthy capital. What will remain are the stories of the men who built it, the ghost army of South Asia, and the lesson that in the 21st century, the most expensive things in the world are often the most worthless. Qatar bought the world for a month, but the bill will last forever. This is built on money. We expose the cost of the world's most expensive mistakes. If you learned something from this autopsy of a $250 billion party, subscribe to the channel. We have more stories of financial ruin coming soon.